The morning sun cast long shadows across Crystal Lake as Jake Williams stood on his cabin porch sipping coffee from his favorite ceramic mug. The water sparkled like diamonds and the pine trees swayed gently in the early breeze. This had been his sanctuary for 15 years, ever since he inherited the modest log cabin from his grandfather Henry Williams. The old man had built it with his own hands back in 1962, when the area was nothing but wilderness and a few scattered fishing shacks. Jake loved the solitude and the connection to nature that the cabin provided. During the week, he worked as a civil engineer in the city, but every weekend and vacation found him here at the lake. He had made modest improvements over the years, adding a small dock and upgrading the electrical system, but always kept the rustic charm that made the place special. The cabin sat on a prime spot with over 200 feet of pristine lakefront and was surrounded by towering oaks and maples that provided perfect shade during the hot summer months. What Jake didn't love was the recent development that had sprung up around the lake. 5 years ago, a developer named Richard Stone had purchased several parcels of land and created Pine Ridge Estates, a gated community with large modern homes and a homeowners association. The HOA had been relatively quiet at first, but recently had become increasingly aggressive about enforcing their rules and regulations, even trying to extend their authority to properties that weren't technically part of their development. HOA president was a woman named Patricia Hartwell, who had moved to Pine Ridge Estates from the suburbs with grand plans to transform the entire lake area into her vision of suburban perfection. She was in her early 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and always dressed as if she was heading to a country club meeting. Patricia had made it clear from the beginning that she viewed Jake's modest cabin as an eyesore that detracted from the upscale image she was trying to cultivate. Over the past year, Patricia had sent Jake several letters suggesting he consider selling his property to the HOA, or at minimum upgrading his cabin to meet their architectural standards. Jake had politely declined each time, explaining that his cabin was on private property that predated their development by decades, and therefore was not subject to their rules. This response had only seemed to make Patricia more determined to find a way to force him out. The situation escalated when Patricia decided to build a new community Clubhouse for Pine Ridge Estates. She chose a location right next to the property, lined between Jake's land and the HOA common area, claiming it would provide the best views of the lake for their members. The clubhouse was an elaborate structure with a large meeting hall, commercial kitchen, and outdoor patio that could accommodate over 100 people for events and gatherings. During the construction process, Jake noticed that the workers seemed to be encroaching on his property line, but Patricia assured him that all proper surveys had been conducted and everything was being built within the HOA boundaries. Jake was busy with a major project at work and decided to trust that the professional surveyors knew what they were doing. It would prove to be a decision he would later regret not pursuing more aggressively at the time. The clubhouse was completed in the spring, and Patricia immediately began hosting elaborate events and fundraisers. The parking lot was always full of expensive cars, and the sound of parties and meetings carried across the water to Jake's cabin. While he didn't particularly enjoy the noise and activity, he recognized that people had a right to use their own property as they saw fit and tried to be a good neighbor. Everything changed on a bright Saturday morning in June when Jake found an official-looking envelope taped to his front door. Inside was a notice from the Pine Ridge Estates HOA, informing him that his property was in violation of several community standards and that he had 30 days to bring his cabin into compliance or face fines and legal action. The letter was signed by Patricia Hartwell in her capacity as HOA president and included a detailed list of violations. According to the notice, Jake's cabin violated the community's architectural standards because it was not constructed with approved materials and colors. The dock was allegedly not properly permitted and extended too far into the lake. His outdoor storage shed was supposedly too close to the property line and not screened from view as required by HOA guidelines. Most significantly, the letter claimed that Jake's entire property was actually part of the Pine Ridge Estates development and therefore subject to all HOA rules and regulations. Jake read the letter 3 times, trying to make sense of the claims. He had lived at the cabin for 15 years and had never been part of any homeowners association. His property taxes were paid directly to the county, and he had never signed any covenants or agreements with Pine Ridge Estates. The idea that his grandfather's land somehow belonged to an HOA that didn't even exist until 5 years ago seemed absurd. The next Monday, Jake called the number listed on the letter and asked to speak with Patricia Hartwell. Her secretary informed him that Mrs. Hartwell was very busy, but could schedule a brief meeting for later in the week. Jake explained that the matter was urgent and involved what appeared to be fraudulent claims about his property ownership, but was told that Patricia's schedule was completely booked and the earliest available appointment was Friday afternoon. Friday couldn't come soon enough for Jake. He spent the week researching property records and reviewing his grandfather's old documents, trying to understand how the HOA could possibly claim jurisdiction over his land. Everything he found confirmed what he already knew. His cabin sat on private property that had been in his family for over 60 years and had never been part of any development or homeowners association. When Friday arrived, Jake drove to the Pine Ridge Estates Clubhouse for his appointment with Patricia. The building was even more impressive up close, with expensive landscaping and elaborate stonework that must have cost a fortune to construct. Jake parked his modest pickup truck between a BMW and a Mercedes and walked through the ornate front doors into a reception area that looked more like a luxury hotel lobby than a community clubhouse. Patricia kept him waiting for 20 minutes before finally appearing in the lobby wearing a designer suit and an expression that suggested she was doing him a tremendous favor by meeting with him. She led him to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake and took a seat at the head of a polished mahogany table that could easily seat 20 people. Patricia began the meeting by explaining that Pine Ridge Estates was committed to maintaining the highest standards of community excellence, and that all properties within their boundaries were expected to comply with their comprehensive covenants, codes, and restrictions. She had a thick binder filled with rules and regulations covering everything from approved paint colors to landscaping, requirements to architectural guidelines for any modifications or improvements. Jake listened patiently before explaining that his property was not part of Pine Ridge Estates, and therefore not subject to their rules. He had brought copies of his deed and property survey to demonstrate that his cabin sat on land that had been privately owned by his family since 1962, decades before Pine Ridge Estates even existed. Patricia barely glanced at the documents before dismissing them as outdated and potentially inaccurate. According to Patricia, the boundaries of Pine Ridge Estates had been carefully surveyed by professional land surveyors, and Jake's cabin clearly fell within their community limits. She claimed that previous surveys might have contained errors and that modern GPS technology had revealed the true property lines. When Jake asked to see these new surveys, Patricia said they were confidential HOA documents that she was not authorized to share with non-members. The meeting became increasingly tense as Patricia made it clear that she expected Jake to comply with the violation notice regardless of his claims about property ownership. She suggested that fighting the HOA would be expensive and time-consuming, and that it would be much easier for everyone. Jake simply agreed to upgrade his cabin to meet their standards or consider selling the property to the HOA at fair market value. Jake left the meeting more frustrated than ever. Patricia's claims made no sense legally, but she seemed completely confident in her position and showed no interest in examining the evidence that contradicted her assertions. It was clear that she was determined to force him out of his cabin one way or another, and was willing to use the HOA's resources and legal authority to make his life as difficult as possible. The following week, Jake received another letter from the HOA informing him that his 30-day compliance period was nearing an end, and that failure to address the violations would result in daily fines of $500. The letter also warned that continued non-compliance could lead to legal action, including the possibility of a lien being placed on his property. Jake knew he needed professional help to deal with the situation. Contacted a local attorney named Michael Thompson, who specialized in property law and homeowners association disputes. Michael had a good reputation in the community and had successfully represented several property owners in conflicts with overly aggressive HOAs. During their initial consultation, Michael reviewed Jake's property documents and the HOA violation notices. He immediately identified several red flags in the HOA's claims and agreed that their assertion of jurisdiction over Jake's property appeared to be completely without merit. Michael explained that HOAs could only enforce their rules on properties that had voluntarily agreed to be bound by their covenants, and that Jake's cabin clearly predated the Pine Ridge Estates development. Michael advised Jake to formally respond to the HOA violation notice with a letter disputing their claims and demanding proof of their alleged jurisdiction over his property. He also recommended that Jake hire his own professional surveyor to confirm the exact boundaries of his land and document any potential encroachments by the HOA Clubhouse or other Pine Ridge Estates facilities. The surveyor, Michael recommended, was a man named Tom Bradley who had been working in the area for over 30 years and had an excellent reputation for accuracy and thoroughness. Tom agreed to conduct a comprehensive boundary survey of Jake's property and compare his findings to the original survey that had been completed when his grandfather first purchased the land. While waiting for the survey results, Jake sent his formal response to the HOA disputing their violation notice and demanding documentation to support their claims of jurisdiction over his property. The letter was polite but firm in asserting Jake's rights as a private property owner and warning the HOA against taking any enforcement actions that could constitute harassment or trespass. Patricia's response came within days and was far less polite than Jake's letter had been. She accused Jake of being a disruptive influence on the community and threatened to pursue all available legal remedies if he continued to resist the HOA's legitimate authority. The letter also included a formal demand that Jake pay the accumulated fines, which had already reached several $1,000s according to their calculations. Tom Bradley completed his survey work after 2 weeks of careful measurements and research. His findings were exactly what Jake had expected, but also revealed something much more significant than anyone had anticipated. Not only was Jake's cabin clearly situated on private property that was not part of Pine Ridge Estates, but the survey showed that a substantial portion of the HOA Clubhouse had actually been constructed on land that belonged to Jake. According to Tom's measurements, the clubhouse foundation extended approximately 15 feet onto Jake's property, and the parking lot encroached even further onto his land. The outdoor patio and landscaping also appeared to be partially situated on Jake's property. In total, the HOA had built thousands of square feet of improvements on land that they did not own and had no legal right to use. Jake stared at the survey results in disbelief. Not only did the HOA have no authority over his cabin, but they had actually trespassed on his property and built a major structure without his permission. The irony was almost too perfect. Patricia Hartwell had been so determined to force Jake off his land that she had unknowingly built her precious clubhouse on property that belonged to him. Michael Thompson was equally amazed when Jake showed him the survey results. In 30 years of practicing property law, he had rarely seen such a clear-cut case of trespass and encroachment. The HOA had not only built on Jake's land without permission, but had then tried to claim jurisdiction over his entire property based on fraudulent assertions about community boundaries. Michael immediately began researching the legal options available to Jake as the rightful owner of the land under the clubhouse. Jake had several potential remedies, including demanding that the structure be removed, seeking monetary damages for the unauthorized use of his property, or potentially negotiating some kind of easement agreement that would allow the clubhouse to remain in exchange for appropriate compensation. Before taking any legal action, Michael recommended that Jake give the HOA an opportunity to acknowledge their mistake and negotiate a reasonable solution. They drafted a letter to Patricia Hartwell, informing her of the survey results and demanding that the HOA immediately cease all enforcement actions against Jake's property while they worked to resolve the encroachment issue. The letter included copies of the survey documentation and clearly explained that the clubhouse had been built partially on Jake's private property without his knowledge or consent. It requested that Patricia provide documentation showing that the HOA had obtained proper permission or legal authority to use Jake's land, and suggested that both parties work together to find a mutually acceptable resolution. Jake hand-delivered the letter to Patricia's office at the clubhouse, knowing that he wanted to see her reaction in person. Patricia read the letter, while Jake waited, her face gradually changing from smug confidence to shock and then anger. A CCU state Jake of fabricating the survey results and claimed that her attorneys would quickly expose his fraudulent claims. When Jake offered to provide the contact information for Tom Bradley so that Patricia could verify the survey results independently, she became even more agitated. She demanded that Jake leave the clubhouse immediately and threatened to call security if he didn't comply. Jake calmly left the building, but not before noticing that several HOA board members, who had been in the lobby during the exchange, looked very concerned about what they had. Overheard. Over the next few days, Jake received several phone calls from Pine Ridge Estates residents who had heard rumors about the property dispute. Some were sympathetic to Jake's situation and expressed frustration with Patricia's heavy-handed tactics. Others seemed to view Jake as a troublemaker who was trying to disrupt their peaceful community with frivolous legal claims. One caller was particularly interesting, a man named Robert Chen, who served on the HOA Board of Directors. Robert explained that he had been uncomfortable with Patricia's aggressive approach toward Jake from the beginning, and had questioned whether the HOA really had authority over properties that weren't part of the original development. He asked if Jake would be willing to meet with him privately to discuss the situation. Jake agreed to meet with Robert at a coffee shop in town away from the Pine Ridge Estates community where they could speak freely. Robert turned out to be a reasonable man who genuinely wanted to understand the facts of the situation rather than simply defend the HOA's position. He had moved to Pine Ridge Estates, the peaceful lakefront lifestyle, and was disturbed by the conflicts that had emerged under Patricia's leadership. Robert explained that Patricia had convinced the board that Jake's property was clearly within the community boundaries and that bringing it into compliance with HOA standards was essential for maintaining property values. She had presented surveys and legal documents that seemed to support her claims, but Robert admitted that he had never examined them carefully or sought independent verification. When Jake showed Robert the survey results, demonstrating that the clubhouse was built partially on his property, Robert was genuinely shocked. He had been involved in the planning and construction of the clubhouse and remembered that Patricia had assured the board that all necessary surveys had been completed and that the building was entirely within HOA boundaries. Robert promised to raise these concerns at the next board meeting and push for an independent review of the property boundaries. He also agreed to advocate for suspending all enforcement actions against Jake until the matter could be properly resolved. Jake appreciated Robert's reasonable approach and felt hopeful that at least some members of the HOA leadership were willing to consider the facts objectively. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening, and Robert invited Jake to attend and present his evidence to the full board. Patricia initially objected to allowing Jake to address the board since he was not a member of the HOA, but the other directors overruled her and agreed that the property dispute was serious enough to warrant a hearing. Jake arrived at the clubhouse on Thursday evening with Michael Thompson and all of their documentation, including the original survey, Tom Bradley's recent survey, and copies of the property deeds dating back to his grandfather's purchase in 1962. The board meeting was held in the same conference room where Jake had met with Patricia weeks earlier, but the atmosphere was much more formal with all 7 board members present and several residents in attendance. Patricia opened the meeting by characterizing Jake's claims as a desperate attempt to avoid complying with legitimate community standards. She presented her own documentation, including surveys that she claimed proved Jake's property was within the Pine Ridge Estates boundaries and therefore subject to HOA authority. However, when the board members asked to examine these surveys more closely, Patricia became evasive and claimed that some of the documents were still being reviewed by the HOA's attorneys. Jake then presented his evidence, starting with the historical documentation showing that his family had owned the property since 1962, decades before Pine Ridge Estates even existed. He showed the original survey from when his grandfather purchased the land and explained how the property boundaries had been clearly established and never disputed until recently. Michael Thompson then presented Tom Bradley's recent survey results, demonstrating not only that Jake's cabin was on private property outside the HOA boundaries, but that a significant portion of the clubhouse had been constructed on Jake's land. The survey documentation was comprehensive and professional, with detailed measurements and clear maps showing exactly where the encroachment had occurred. The reaction from the board members was immediate and dramatic. Several directors demanded to know how Patricia could have assured them that the clubhouse was entirely within HOA boundaries when it was now clear that a substantial portion of the building was on private property. Patricia became defensive and accused Jake of hiring a surveyor to produce fraudulent results, but her claims sounded increasingly desperate as the evidence against her mounted. Robert Chen asked Patricia to produce the surveys that she claimed supported the HOA's position, but Patricia said they were locked in her office, safe, and could not be retrieved until the next day. When another board member offered to accompany her to retrieve the documents immediately, Patricia became agitated and said that the surveys were actually in the possession of the HOA's attorney and could not be disclosed. Without legal review, the meeting continued for over 2 hours as board members questioned Patricia about her handling of the property dispute and demanded explanations for the apparent encroachment on Jake's land. It became increasingly clear that Patricia had either made serious errors in her research or had deliberately misrepresented the facts to the board in order to pursue her personal vendetta against Jake. By the end of the meeting, the board had voted to immediately suspend all enforcement actions against Jake's property and to hire an independent surveyor to verify the property boundaries. They also voted to place Patricia on administrative leave, pending a full investigation of her conduct in the matter. Robert Chen was appointed as interim president and given authority to negotiate with Jake regarding the clubhouse encroachment. Jake left the meeting feeling vindicated, but also somewhat sorry for the HOA residents who had been misled by Patricia's actions. Many of them were good people who had simply wanted to live in a well-maintained community and had trusted their elected leader to act in their best interests. Patricia's obsession with forcing Jake off his property had put the entire HOA at legal and financial risk. Over the next week, Robert Chen worked with Michael Thompson to develop a framework for resolving the encroachment issue. Since the clubhouse had already been built and was being used by the community, Jake agreed to consider granting an easement. That would allow the structure to remain on his property in exchange for appropriate compensation and a formal acknowledgement that his cabin property was not subject to HOA authority. The negotiations were conducted in good faith, with both parties recognizing that a reasonable compromise would be better than expensive litigation. Jake's primary goals were to secure recognition of his property rights and to be left alone to enjoy his cabin in peace. The HOA's main concern was avoiding the massive cost of relocating or rebuilding the clubhouse, which would have bankrupted the organization. After several days of discussions, they reached an agreement that addressed everyone's main concerns. Jake would grant a permanent easement allowing the clubhouse to remain on his property in exchange for a one-time payment of $50,000 and a formal covenant stating that his cabin property would never be subject to HOA rules or enforcement actions. The HOA would also be required to maintain comprehensive liability insurance covering any activities on Jake's property and to obtain his written consent before making any modifications to the clubhouse or surrounding areas. The agreement was presented to the HOA membership at a special meeting where it was approved by an overwhelming majority. Most residents were relieved to avoid the potential disaster of having to demolish and rebuild their community clubhouse and appreciated Jake's willingness to negotiate a reasonable solution rather than pursuing more aggressive legal remedies. Patricia Hartwell did not attend the membership meeting and submitted her resignation as HOA president shortly after the agreement was finalized. According to rumors in the community, she was facing potential legal action from the HOA for her mismanagement of the property dispute and had decided to sell her home and move away from Pine Ridge Estates rather than deal with the ongoing controversy. The independent survey commissioned by the HOA confirmed Tom Bradley's findings and revealed additional details about how the encroachment had occurred. Apparently, Patricia had hired a surveyor who was a personal friend rather than selecting a qualified professional through a competitive bidding process. This surveyor had either made serious errors in his measurements or had been pressured to produce results that supported Patricia's predetermined conclusions about the property boundaries. With the legal dispute resolved, Jake was finally able to return his attention to enjoying his lakefront cabin. The $50,000 settlement payment allowed him to make some improvements he had been considering, including a new roof and upgraded kitchen appliances. More importantly, he no longer had to worry about harassment from the HOA or threats to his peaceful enjoyment of the property. The new HOA leadership under Robert Chen proved to be much more reasonable and respectful of Jake's rights as a neighboring property owner. They established clear policies regarding interaction with non-HOA properties and implemented better oversight. Procedures to prevent future disputes like the one that had nearly destroyed the organization. Jake's relationship with his Pine Ridge estates neighbors also improved significantly once the facts of the property dispute became known throughout the community. Many residents apologized for supporting Patricia's aggressive tactics and expressed appreciation for Jake's willingness to negotiate a fair resolution rather than forcing the HOA into bankruptcy through litigation. The clubhouse continued to host community events and meetings, but now operated under the terms of Jake's easement agreement, which included restrictions on noise levels and operating hours that ensured his cabin remained a peaceful retreat. Jake occasionally attended public events at the clubhouse and found that most of his neighbors were actually quite pleasant once they got to know him personally, rather than viewing him as an obstacle to their community vision. One unexpected benefit of the entire ordeal was that Jake met several other property owners around the lake who had been facing similar pressure from overly aggressive HOAs. He was able to share his experience and the legal strategies that had proven successful in defending his property rights. Michael Thompson also developed a reputation as an expert in HOA disputes and began representing other homeowners who were dealing with similar situations. The story of Jake's successful defense of his cabin property became something of a legend in the local property rights community. It demonstrated that individual homeowners could successfully stand up to well-funded HOAs. When they had the facts and law on their side and were willing to fight for their rights, Jake received calls and emails from property owners as far away as other states asking for advice on dealing with HOA overreach. Looking back on the experience, Jake realized that his grandfather's decision to purchase the lakefront property back in 1962 had been even wiser than anyone could have imagined at the time. Not only had the land provided decades of family enjoyment and recreation, but it had also turned out to be the key to resolving a major legal dispute that could have cost the Bay Ridge Estates, HOA, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Jake also gained a new appreciation for the importance of maintaining accurate property records and understanding exactly what you own. If he had not kept his grandfather's original documents and survey records, he might not have been able to prove his ownership claim so definitively. The experience reinforced his belief that property rights are fundamental to freedom and prosperity. It must be vigilantly defended against those who would abuse positions of authority. The cabin remained Jake's favorite place to relax and recharge. Away from the stresses of city life and his demanding career as a civil engineer, he continued to make modest improvements over the years, always respecting the rustic character that made the place special while ensuring that it remained comfortable and functional for his needs. As he sat on his porch on weekend mornings watching the sunrise over Crystal Lake, Jake often reflected on how the property dispute had ultimately strengthened his connection to the land and his commitment to preserving its peaceful character for future generations. The cabin had been in his family for over 60 years, and with proper care and maintenance, it would hopefully remain a treasured retreat for many decades to come. The Pine Ridge Estates community also benefited from the lessons learned during the property dispute. The new HOA leadership implemented better governance procedures, more transparent decision-making processes, and stronger protections for individual property rights. The community became known as one of the more reasonable and well-managed HOAs in the region, attracting new residents who appreciated the emphasis on cooperation rather than confrontation. Years later, when Jake would tell the story of his battle with the HOA, people were always amazed by the irony that Patricia Hartwell's attempts to force him off his property had led to the discovery that she had built her precious clubhouse on his land. It was a perfect example of how aggressive tactics and dishonest behavior often backfire on those who employ them, while those who stand firm on principle and truth usually prevail in the end. The experience also taught Jake valuable lessons about The importance of getting professional help when dealing with complex legal issues. Without Michael Thompson's expertise in property law and Tom Bradley's careful survey work, Jake might not have been able to prove his case so convincingly. The investment in professional services had paid for itself many times over through the successful resolution of the dispute. Jake never regretted his decision to fight the HOA's bogus claims, even though it had required months of stress and uncertainty. The principle at stake was too important to compromise, and the potential consequences of giving in to Patricia's demands would have been devastating to his enjoyment of the cabin and his family's legacy at Crystal Lake. The story served as an inspiration to other property owners who found themselves facing similar challenges from overzealous HOAs or local government officials. It demonstrated that individual citizens could successfully defend their rights when they had the courage to stand up for what was right and the persistence to see the fight through to the end. In the years following the resolution of the property dispute, Jake became something of an informal advisor to other property owners dealing with boundary disputes, easement issues, and HOA conflicts. He was always willing to share his experience and connect people with the professional resources they needed to protect their property rights effectively. The cabin at Crystal Lake remained a symbol of the importance of individual property rights and the dangers of allowing organizations to exceed their legitimate authority. Jake's successful defense of his family's land had protected not only his own interests, but it also established important precedents that would benefit other property owners facing similar challenges in the future. As Jake approached retirement, he began thinking about how to ensure that the cabin would remain in his family for future generations. He worked with Michael Thompson to establish a family trust that would protect the property from potential future disputes while providing clear guidelines for its use and maintenance by his children and grandchildren. The trust documents included detailed records of the property boundaries, easement agreements, and the history of the HOA dispute to ensure that future family members would understand exactly what they owned and how to protect it. Jake wanted to make sure that his descendants would never face the kind of uncertainty and harassment that he had experienced when Tricia Hartwell tried to claim authority over his land. The Pine Ridge Estates Clubhouse continued to operate successfully under the easement agreement, serving the community's needs while respecting Jake's property rights. The building had become a symbol of how reasonable people could resolve even complex disputes through good faith negotiation and mutual respect for each other's legitimate interests. Jake's story was eventually featured in several property rights publications and legal journals as an example of successful resistance to HOA overreach. Law schools began using the case as a teaching tool to help future attorneys understand the complexities of property law and the importance of thorough research and documentation in boundary disputes. The experience had transformed Jake from a quiet weekend cabin owner into an accidental expert on property rights and HOA disputes. While he had never sought such a role, he embraced the opportunity to help others protect their property and defend their rights against those who would abuse positions of authority for personal gain. Looking back on the entire experience, Jake realized that his grandfather's simple decision to buy a piece of lakefront property and build a modest cabin had created a legacy that extended far beyond family recreation. The land had become a symbol of individual liberty, property rights, and the importance of standing up for what is right, even when facing powerful opposition. The morning sun continued to rise over Crystal Lake each day, just as it had for decades before the HOA dispute, and would for many years to come. Jake's cabin remained a peaceful retreat where he could enjoy the simple pleasures of lakefront living, while knowing that he had successfully defended his family's right to be there. The story of Jake Williams and his battle with the Pine Ridge Estates HOA had become more than just a property dispute. It was a testament to the enduring importance of property rights and the power of individuals to defend their freedoms when they have the courage to stand firm on principle and the wisdom to seek professional help when facing complex legal challenges. As Jake sat on his porch each morning watching the lake come alive with the new day, he felt grateful not only for the peaceful setting that surrounded him, but also for the opportunity he had been given to defend something important and to help establish precedents that would protect other property owners for years to come. The cabin at Crystal Lake would always be more than just a weekend retreat. It was a symbol of the successful defense of individual rights. against institutional overreach and a reminder that truth and justice usually prevail when people have the courage to fight for what is right.